Petty Officer Second Class Raina Solis received the encrypted message at midnight. Base communications will be compromised at 600. Trust no one in the chain of command. 7 hours later, as she watched the lighthouse beacon that guided naval vessels to safety flicker and die, she would discover that some betrayals are planned years in advance and executed by people who swore the same oath to protect their country. Petty Officer Second Class Raina Solis monitored the communication, a raise from her station in the lighthouse tower that overlooked the entrance to Naval Station Kodiak in Alaska. The converted lighthouse served as both a navigational beacon for incoming vessels and a critical communications hub for operations throughout the North Pacific region. At 26, Raina was the senior communications technician responsible for maintaining contact between the base and naval operations, spanning from the Aleutian Islands to the Bering Sea. Her expertise in radio systems and cryptographic equipment had been developed through 6 years of Navy service that began with basic electronics training and evolved into specialized work with classified communication protocols. The lighthouse itself was a remnant from the 1940s, when it had guided merchant vessels through dangerous waters during World War II. Now it housed sophisticated radar and communication equipment that made it one of the most important links in the Pacific Fleet's intelligence network. Her shift partner, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, had been acting strangely for the past week, arriving late, making unusual equipment checks, and asking questions about communication schedules that seemed to go beyond normal operational curiosity. Raina's instincts, developed through years of handling sensitive information, suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. The encrypted warning message had arrived through channels she'd been taught to use only in emergency, situations where normal command structure couldn't be trusted. Someone inside the base was planning something that would compromise their communications capability, and Raina found herself in the position of not knowing who could be trusted with that information. Subscribe to hear more stories of veterans who discovered that the most dangerous enemies sometimes wear the same uniform and know exactly how to exploit the systems they swore to protect. Raina's expertise with communication systems had been shaped by her father, Roberto Solis, a former Navy radioman who'd served during the Cold War when maintaining secure communications could mean the difference between peace and nuclear warfare. He'd taught her that electronic systems were only as trustworthy as the people operating them, and that understanding both technology and human nature was essential for protecting critical information. Her father had spent 22 years in the Navy, much of it stationed at remote communication posts, where small teams handled intelligence that affected global operations. He'd passed down skills that weren't taught in any technical manual: how to detect unauthorized access to communication systems, how to recognize when equipment had been tampered with, and most importantly, how to maintain secure communications when standard protocols had been compromised. When Raina enlisted, her natural aptitude for electronics and her understanding of communication security had made her valuable for assignments requiring both technical skill and discretion. She'd completed advanced training in cryptographic systems, emergency communication protocols, and counterintelligence procedures. Her assignment to the Lighthouse station had been presented as a routine rotation, but she'd gradually realized that her position provided access to intelligence flowing between major Pacific Fleet operations and Navy headquarters. The Lighthouse wasn't just a communication relay, it was a critical node in a network that coordinated submarine movements, carrier operations, and intelligence gathering throughout the region. The trust placed in her by the Navy went beyond normal security clearances. She'd been given access to communication channels and encryption keys that were reserved for personnel considered absolutely reliable, and that trust had become the foundation of her military identity and personal values. The investigation into potential security breaches was being conducted by Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, a naval intelligence officer who'd arrived at the base 2 months earlier as part of a routine security review. Despite Raina's specialized knowledge of the communication systems and her access to technical logs that could reveal unauthorized activity, Hayes had excluded her from the investigation process. Hayes's approach focused on standard counterintelligence procedures, background checks, financial investigations, and interviews with personnel who had access to classified information. She dismissed Rayner's concerns about unusual equipment behavior and unauthorized access patterns as technical issues that didn't require intelligence analysis. The conflict escalated when Rayner reported that someone had been accessing communication equipment during off-duty hours using authorization codes that should have been restricted to specific personnel. Hayes had characterized these incidents as administrative errors rather than potential security breaches, and had ordered Rayner to focus on routine maintenance rather than investigating suspicious activity. Other officers supported Hayes's position, arguing that Rayner's technical background didn't qualify her to assess security threats, and that her concerns about equipment tampering reflected inexperience with standard maintenance procedures. They pointed out that the Lighthouse station had never experienced security incidents, and that increased scrutiny might be creating problems where none existed. The most troubling aspect was Hayes's insistence that Rayner submit all technical logs and access records for review, effectively removing her ability to monitor for suspicious activity while the investigation continued. The order felt less like security precaution and more like an attempt to eliminate oversight of critical systems. When Rayner requested permission to implement additional monitoring procedures, Hayes had refused and suggested that excessive concern about security was interfering with her ability to perform routine communication duties. Standing in the lighthouse tower as the beacon continued its automated sweep across the rocky coastline, Rayner felt the isolation that came with possessing knowledge that no one in authority wanted to hear. Her training and instincts provided clear evidence that their communication systems were being compromised, but protocol prevented her from acting on that knowledge. The encrypted warning message had arrived through channels her father had taught her about during their conversations about Cold War communication procedures. Someone with access to historical Navy cryptographic systems was trying to warn her that the current investigation was compromised, but she had no way to verify the source or authenticity of the information. What disturbed her most was the pattern of equipment access that she'd been documenting for weeks before Hayes's arrival. The unauthorized activity wasn't random or amateur. It showed sophisticated understanding of their systems and access to codes that were restricted to a small number of personnel. Someone with extensive knowledge of Navy communication protocols was systematically compromising their security. Her father's warnings about Cold War security breaches echoed in her memory. The most dangerous infiltration came from people who understood the system well enough to exploit it without triggering obvious alarms. Technical logs could be altered, access records could be falsified, and security procedures could be turned into tools for hiding rather than detecting unauthorized activity. The personal stakes were higher than just following orders or maintaining her career. The communication systems she protected were responsible for coordinating operations that kept thousands of Navy personnel safe, and any compromise could have consequences that reached far beyond their isolated lighthouse station. She closed her eyes and made the same promise her father had taught her: protect the mission, even when protecting it means going against people who should be on your side. Rayner's monitoring of communication traffic revealed patterns that confirmed her worst suspicions. Someone was using their systems to transmit information to unauthorized recipients, carefully timing the transmissions to avoid detection by standard security procedures. The data being transmitted included operational schedules, personnel movements, and intelligence summaries that could compromise active Navy operations throughout the Pacific. More alarming was her discovery that the unauthorized transmissions were being routed through backup systems that bypassed normal logging procedures, suggesting that whoever was responsible had detailed knowledge of their equipment and access to technical documentation that should have been restricted to authorized personnel. When she attempted to report these findings to Hayes, the response was immediate and decisive. Rayner was ordered to cease all monitoring activities beyond routine maintenance, submit all technical documentation for review, and report any unusual observations through official channels rather than conducting independent analysis. The situation escalated when Rayner realized that the order to submit her documentation would provide whoever was compromising their systems with detailed information about her investigation, effectively eliminating her ability to detect or prevent further security breaches. Other personnel began avoiding conversations with her, and she noticed that her access to certain technical areas had been restricted without official notification. The Lighthouse station, which had always felt like a trusted assignment, began to feel like a place where her expertise was being used against her rather than in service to her mission. As the lighthouse beacon continued its sweep across the coastline, Rayna faced the decision between following orders that would allow the security breach to continue, or taking action to protect their communication systems regardless of the consequences for her career and safety. The encrypted warning message had included specific instructions for emergency procedures, but implementing them would require her to act against direct orders and potentially expose herself to charges of insubordination, or worse. Rayna made her decision during the pre-dawn hours when the lighthouse was operating on minimal personnel. Using techniques her father had taught her about emergency communication protocols, she began implementing backup procedures that would preserve critical intelligence while isolating compromised systems from the main network. The process required her to physically disconnect primary communication arrays and activate secondary systems that had been installed decades earlier as Cold War emergency backup. These older systems weren't connected to the networks that had been compromised, but they also weren't part of current standard operating procedures. As she worked to secure their communication capability, the lighthouse beacon began showing signs of the same systematic compromise she'd detected in their radio systems. Someone was preparing to disable their navigational beacon at a time when several Navy vessels were scheduled to approach the base during dangerous weather conditions. The truth became clear when she intercepted communications between Chief Webb and Lieutenant Commander Hayes. They were part of a long-term intelligence operation designed to compromise Navy communications and provide operational information to foreign agents. The Lighthouse station had been selected because of its critical role in Pacific Fleet communications and its isolation from direct oversight. Webb had been documenting communication schedules and encryption procedures for months, while Hayes had used her intelligence position to prevent detection of their activities and eliminate personnel who might discover the operation. Rayna's expertise and attention to detail had made her a threat that needed to be removed. The plan was elegantly simple: disable the lighthouse beacon during a scheduled approach by Navy vessels, creating a crisis situation that would require emergency response and provide cover for eliminating Rayna as someone who'd been compromised by the stress of the incident. But Rayna's implementation of emergency communication protocols had isolated their systems from the compromised network, preventing Webb and Hayes from completing their plan, while simultaneously preserving the intelligence evidence that would expose their operation. Rayna's activation of emergency procedures triggered automatic alerts to Navy counterintelligence headquarters, bypassing the compromised local chain of command and initiating a response that Webb and Hayes couldn't prevent or control. The preserved communication logs provided clear evidence of their unauthorized transmissions and systematic compromise of security procedures. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the intelligence operation. Webb and Hayes had been working together for over 2 years, using their positions to gather operational information about Pacific Fleet movements and communication procedures. Their intelligence had been transmitted to foreign agents who were using it to track Navy operations and potentially compromise missions throughout the region. Hayes' role as the security investigator had been specifically designed to prevent detection of their activities while identifying and eliminating personnel who might discover the operation. Her orders restricting Rayna's access and monitoring capabilities had been intended to blind the lighthouse station to the systematic compromise of their systems. The transformation in how Navy leadership viewed Rayna's technical expertise was immediate and comprehensive. Her detection of the security breach and preservation of critical intelligence under dangerous circumstances demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and technical skill that the Navy valued in its communication specialists. Within months, Rayna had been promoted and assigned to Navy counterintelligence, with responsibility for developing procedures to detect and prevent similar compromises of communication systems. Her father's Cold War emergency protocols became part of standard training for personnel handling sensitive communications at isolated stations. The Lighthouse beacon was restored to full operation, but the station's communication systems were completely rebuilt with additional security measures designed to prevent unauthorized access and detect tampering. Rayna's techniques for monitoring system integrity became standard procedure for all Navy communication facilities. Most importantly, the case established new protocols for handling security concerns raised by technical personnel, recognizing that operational expertise often provided the first indication of security problems that traditional counterintelligence methods might miss. Webb and Hayes faced court-martial proceedings that resulted in lengthy prison sentences and dishonorable discharge, but the real victory was the preservation of Navy communication security and the prevention of intelligence compromise that could have affected operations throughout the Pacific region. The Lighthouse beam that had swept the rocks one last time before the planned shutdown now continued its protective sweep, guided by systems that Rayna had secured against betrayal from within. The beacon served as a reminder that sometimes the most important duty is protecting the mission from people who were supposed to be protecting it with you